Well, what a strange race, eh? On the one hand, it felt incredibly straightforward and vanilla, but then on the other we had split strategies, multiple safety cars, and baffling incidents that left the top three laughing in the cooldown room. We've discussed the difference between fans and spectators before, and as with many things in our sport, this race may be lost on those that merely spectate, as small details and individual brilliance are the things that dictated the Grand Prix in Shanghai. The most surprised person of the weekend has to be Lando Norris, who on a side note made a brilliant return to the podium with his signature champagne slam, as the McLaren driver was completely lost as to where his competition was. Revealing that he had a bet with his engineers that Ferrari would be 35 seconds down the road, his surprise was made apparent in the post-race interviews in regard to the lack of red on the podium, and it was entirely understandable. The thing that made the race so understated this weekend was the gaps between the top drivers, gaps that are normally filled with red cars, and yet the Scuderia were found lacking. Want to know how the race unfolded in China? It was a weird one really, with an awful lot of unexpected movement. And stick around, because is it just us, or were Ferrari missing today? And is a certain Ferrari driver starting to look a bit desperate? Surely at this point it must be a bit boring for Max Verstappen fans. You never see the guy on TV apart from the first and last laps and pit stops. You don't even get to see the hyper-aggressive driving style of his back being against the wall or facing adversity. At some point, lights out, checkered flag, Dutch national anthem has to lose its shine, right? Well, if it is for anyone, then it certainly hasn't for Max Verstappen, as he never looked under any threat at all for P1 today. Behind him, an interesting race of mixed strategies and fortunes unfolded, where Lando Norris secured an incredibly tidy P2 and Sergio Perez brought home a P3 in a pretty no-man's land race for all of the top six by the end of it. An Alonso resurgence at the end of the race covered over the cracks of a pretty poorly executed race for the Aston Martin team, yet again relying on the brilliance of the Spanish driver to rescue what would have otherwise been a disastrous race weekend. A safety car fracas saw 5 drivers fall victim to Kevin Magnussen and Lance Stroll, who, as the duo who would later have an entertaining scuffle of their own after they decided they no longer felt like playing Wreckfest, caused absolute mayhem, some even before the restart had even occurred. It would have been interesting to get a real representation of how competitive McLaren truly is, with Norris's prior discussed heroics being counteracted by an unfortunate Piastri, whose race also fell victim to Lance Stroll, not expecting cars to break into a corner. It's hard to tell whether McLaren truly had the second fastest car this weekend, or if it was just individual brilliance on the part of Norris. There's been a pretty consistent theme to Ferrari's season in the opening rounds. If Sainz has been at the track, he has been on the podium. Charles Leclerc's lead over his teammates going into the weekend likely was entirely down to Carlos's absence from the Jeddah race, as his appendix made like Lance Stroll on a safety car restart, and Carlos seemed to have his teammate beat. However, something seemed to change in the weeks between Japan and China. The Ferraris were, as they seemed to be pretty consistently, pretty close to each other throughout the sprint race, with the cars getting a bit too close to comfort towards the back end of the sprint event. Following the contact in the sprint race, Charles had a pretty accusatory remark for his teammate. "Let's speak. We're fighting more. He's fighting more me than others." Before going on to claim that there was more potential for points in the final laps, which was ruined by Carlos Sainz. We went through that in the past and it went really well, so I have no worries that will also be the case this weekend. But today he went a bit over the limit. Contact between us two being in a different race situation, because I had saved quite a bit with the tyres and I had a good pace at the end, so it's a bit of a shame that we lost that gap to Perez and couldn't overtake him. According to Nico Rosberg, before the race there were talks held between the Ferrari drivers in an attempt to clear the air and for Carlos and Charles to draw a line under the incident. Nico Rosberg revealed this on Sky F1. "I have heard that, internally, there was a rather sincere discussion. Charles is someone who won't go to the very limit of internally being aggressive. We've seen that. Carlos was forthcoming and apologetic, so apparently things are more or less okay again." Now, in the past, I've made my thoughts on Charles pretty clear. He is a fantastic driver, especially over one lap, who drives close to the line and has a finesse in his drives not seen by many other drivers in the sport. However, in my opinion of course, the thing that Charles lacks is the killer instinct, or the inner bastard as Will Buxton once referred to it. It could be down to Charles's off-track soft demeanor and being partially brainwashed by Leclerc fan edits on Twitter, but he has always just seemed a bit more Charles Chaplin than Charles Manson. All of that, as well as all the talk about water being under the bridge between the Ferrari drivers, seemed to go out to the window this weekend, with Charles getting out his elbows at the beginning of the race in order to push Carlos wide at the first corner and asserting himself as the lead Ferrari driver in the race. It was, for a short period, a detriment to both Ferrari drivers, who fell behind the Haas of Nico Hülkenberg. However, by the time of the Bottas-borne safety car around lap 23, the drivers were split by Sergio Perez, with Sainz in 5th and Leclerc in 3rd. This was the first time this year where it seemed that Leclerc had Sainz's number, something that Charles has been aiming for ever since the start of the season. Following last weekend, Charles made it clear that he understood his homework. I think it's as simple as he's been doing a better job. I've been struggling to put the lap together. It's a very fine line to get it right or completely wrong on the outlap and putting the tyres in the right window. For now, I've been struggling more than what Carlos has done, and he's driving at a very high level. I have been working a lot on that, and normally when I work on points, I'm quite confident on improving pretty quickly. I'm not worried, but obviously now I need to show that on track. Following the race in China, Charles was far more satisfied with his performance, however acknowledged that the overall pace of the Scuderia cars was lacking this weekend, with the Monegasque having this to say: "The best result we could get today was this, because in terms of pace unfortunately McLaren had more today. We knew about the strength of Red Bull, but not that of Lando. We struggled with the hard tyres. With the mediums we didn't go bad, but with the hard this was the pace. The difference was incredible. With the mediums we went as fast as McLaren, if not faster, but with the hard we were half a second slower, so we have to analyse this aspect." Leclerc would go on to hinge hopes of the team asserting themselves as the second fastest on the upcoming upgrades in Miami, and Sainz would likewise assert that McLaren were just the stronger team this weekend and that it is now down to the team to reply to their closest competitors. The worry we have for Sainz is that the longer the ambiguity around his future lingers, the more desperate we may see him get. It's less the move on his teammate in the sprint than it was the move on Fernando Alonso on the same lap and the qualifying crash that looked a bit more along the lines of an animal backed into a corner rather than a smooth operator. Sainz seemed to be a bit cooler in the race following the pre-race discussion and the opening scuffle with his teammate. However, he is still a lone driver in the hunt for seats that are fast disappearing or fast becoming less and less desirable. Don't get me wrong, Sainz still had a strong race weekend and is still demonstrating his capacity to drive at the highest level. We're not witnessing a crisis of identity or a driver just losing all capacity and poise. However, the screw is certainly being turned more and more for every week that his future remains unclear. We hope for Sainz, Ferrari, and whoever his future team ends up being sake that his future can be put to bed sooner rather than later, before things get ugly in the current season, or even worse, the lack of interest starts to make a long-term dent on his confidence. For the time being, Ferrari is still on track to be the number 2 team in this year, or number 1 in the Mortal Championships, just as Carlos Sainz is still on track for a good season. However, for both parties, they need to ensure that they don't lose their heads or allow themselves to be complacent with what they are doing, because whether it's potential seats or second in the championship, there may well be another driver or team ready to snatch it all away from you.